Historical records indicate that within several East Asian royal courts, particularly during periods such as the Tang, Song, Ming, Joseon, and earlier imperial administrations influenced by Confucian bureaucratic ideals, the institution of the concubine was not merely a domestic arrangement, but a regulated political structure embedded within the wider hierarchy of court life. These women occupied a legally and socially defined position beneath the empress or primary consort, yet still within the inner palace system that functioned as both a domestic space and an administrative extension of state authority. Their conduct, movements, and even interpersonal relationships were subject to codified expectations that reflected broader principles of order, hierarchy, and moral discipline as defined by ruling elites. Surviving legal codes and palace regulations suggest that concubines were incorporated into a rigid ranking system, often divided into multiple grades with corresponding privileges and restrictions. Advancement or demotion within this system was not solely dependent on personal favor, but also on documented behavior, adherence to ritual protocol, and perceived conformity to court ethics. In many dynasties, the inner palace was governed by eunuch administrators and female palace officials who reported directly to higher authority figures, including the empress or imperial household bureau. These administrative layers created a controlled environment in which discipline was enforced through surveillance, record keeping, and structured punishment mechanisms. Punishment systems applied within royal concubinage were not arbitrary, but institutionalized. Contemporary accounts describe a range of corrective measures that varied depending on the severity of perceived infractions. Minor breaches of etiquette, such as improper dress, failure to observe ritual hierarchy, or unauthorized movement within restricted areas, could result in deprivation of privileges, reduction of stipends, or demotion in rank. More serious accusations, particularly those involving breaches of loyalty, misconduct within palace boundaries, or violations of strict separation rules between palace ranks, could trigger formal investigations conducted by palace supervisory offices. Legal codes of the period reveal that punishment within the inner court was closely tied to Confucian moral expectations. The concubine was expected to embody restraint, obedience, and ritual correctness, serving as both a participant in imperial lineage continuity and a symbolic representation of order within the sovereign household. When violations occurred, the response was framed not only as discipline of an individual, but as restoration of moral equilibrium within the palace system. This conceptual framing allowed punitive measures to be justified as necessary for maintaining dynastic legitimacy. Corporal punishment, while varying across dynasties and periods, was in some cases permitted under regulated conditions. Historical records indicate that sanctioned disciplinary actions could include confinement within designated palace quarters, enforced isolation from court activities, or supervised punishment carried out by female attendants assigned to enforcement duties. However, these actions were typically mediated through bureaucratic authorization rather than immediate personal retaliation, reflecting the broader imperial tendency to formalize governance even within domestic spaces. Palace hierarchy also relied heavily on exile within the palace system itself. Rather than physical removal from the court, a concubine might be reassigned to distant or less prestigious quarters of the inner palace complex, effectively reducing her visibility and influence. Such relocation functioned as both punishment and political neutralization, limiting access to imperial attention and thereby diminishing the possibility of advancement or factional support. In highly stratified courts, visibility itself was a form of power, and its withdrawal carried significant consequences. Contemporary accounts describe how accusations played a central role in triggering disciplinary proceedings. Within the tightly controlled environment of the inner palace, interpersonal competition was structurally embedded as rank and favor directly influenced survival and status. Informant networks, both formal and informal, contributed to a system in which behavior was continuously monitored and reported. While official documentation emphasized procedural fairness, historical analysis suggests that outcomes could be influenced by factional alliances within the palace administration, including eunuch networks and senior consort groups aligned with different political interests. In cases involving allegations deemed severe, such as violations of imperial security protocols or breaches that threatened dynastic legitimacy, the matter could be escalated beyond internal palace discipline to imperial adjudication. The emperor or designated high-ranking officials would review reports compiled by palace investigators. Legal traditions of certain dynasties indicate that punishments in such cases could extend to house arrest, forced confinement for extended periods, or in extreme circumstances, removal from the palace system entirely. However, interpretations of severity varied widely depending on the political climate and the specific dynasty in question. The psychological and social dimensions of this system were shaped by constant uncertainty. The absence of fixed security within rank advancement meant that status could shift rapidly based on court favor, accusation, or administrative decision. This volatility reinforced conformity, as deviation from expected conduct carried not only immediate penalties, but also long-term implications for survival within the palace hierarchy. The system thus operated as both governance structure and behavioral regulator, ensuring that the inner court remained aligned with broader imperial objectives. Chroniclers noted that the enforcement of discipline within concubine ranks was closely tied to the symbolic role of the imperial household. The palace was understood as a microcosm of the state, and disorder within its confines was interpreted as reflecting potential instability in governance more broadly. As a result, even minor infractions could be treated with disproportionate seriousness if they were perceived to undermine ritual hierarchy or court discipline. This symbolic weight intensified the regulatory framework governing concubine behavior. Despite the severity associated with punishment systems, it is important to note that administrative records also show periods of procedural restraint, particularly in well-organized bureaucratic dynasties where legalist or Confucian reforms sought to standardize enforcement mechanisms. In such contexts, penalties were more likely to be documented, reviewed, and justified through formal channels rather than executed through personal authority. This reflects a broader trend in imperial governance toward institutional control over private or emotional decision-making within the ruling household. Within this tightly regulated environment, concubines existed at the intersection of personal vulnerability and institutional significance. Their status made them both participants in and subjects of imperial power structures. The punishment systems applied to them were therefore not isolated practices but integral components of palace governance, reflecting broader principles of hierarchy, discipline, and statecraft that extended far beyond the inner court itself. Historical records indicate that as palace institutions matured across different East Asian dynastic systems, the regulation of concubines became increasingly formalized through layered bureaucratic oversight, particularly during the Ming and Joseon periods where Confucian administrative philosophy deeply shaped court governance. The inner palace was not treated as a private household in the modern sense, but rather as an extension of state order, in which every rank, movement, and interaction was subject to codified expectations. Within this framework, punishment systems evolved into structured mechanisms designed to correct behavior, preserve hierarchy, and prevent the emergence of informal power centers that could challenge imperial authority. Surviving administrative manuals and court regulations suggest that punishment was closely tied to the concept of graded responsibility. Concubine of higher rank, while enjoying greater privileges, was also subject to more severe scrutiny, as her conduct carried symbolic weight within the palace hierarchy. Lower-ranking consorts, meanwhile, were more vulnerable to immediate disciplinary action from palace supervisors or senior attendants. This stratification ensured that discipline operated not as a uniform system, but as a differentiated framework calibrated to rank, influence, and proximity to imperial authority. Contemporary accounts describe how the enforcement of rules often relied on female palace officials, sometimes referred to in historical texts as matron supervisors or senior court ladies, who acted as intermediaries between imperial authority and the concubine ranks. These officials were responsible for monitoring etiquette compliance, managing daily schedules, and reporting deviations to higher administrative bodies. Their role was crucial in translating abstract legal codes into practical enforcement within the enclosed environment of the inner palace. In many cases, punishment began not with direct imperial intervention, but with written reports compiled by these supervisory figures. Legal codes of the period reveal that one of the most common disciplinary mechanisms was reduction of rank. In highly structured concubinage hierarchies, even a single demotion could significantly alter a woman's access to resources, living quarters, and potential influence. Demoted concubine would typically be reassigned to less favorable palace quarters, receive reduced stipends, and lose participation in ceremonial gatherings. This form of punishment was particularly effective because it targeted the social and symbolic dimensions of status rather than relying solely on physical coercion. Another widely documented form of discipline was enforced isolation. Historical records indicate that concubines accused of violating palace protocol could be confined to designated quarters for extended periods, during which their contact with other members of the court was strictly regulated. This isolation served multiple purposes. It prevented the spread of perceived misconduct, limited factional alliances, and allowed investigations to proceed without external influence. In certain dynasties, isolation also functioned as a cooling-off mechanism, intended to reassert control without immediately resorting to more severe penalties. More serious cases involve formal investigations conducted by palace judicial offices or eunuch-led administrative bureaus. These investigations followed procedural frameworks that included witness testimony, written petitions, and verification of reported incidents. Although the appearance of due process was maintained, historical analysis suggests that outcomes could still be influenced by internal palace politics, particularly when senior consorts or influential eunuchs aligned themselves with competing factions. The investigation process itself often served as a form of punishment, as accused individuals were placed under surveillance and restricted from normal court participation during the inquiry. Historical records from the Ming imperial household system indicate that certain infractions were classified under categories related to moral conduct, ritual violation, and security breach. Moral infractions included accusations of inappropriate behavior, breaches of chastity codes, or failure to observe prescribed conduct in relation to imperial rituals. Ritual violations were treated with particular seriousness, as they were believed to reflect disorder within the symbolic structure of the state. Security-related offenses, though less frequently documented, involved actions perceived as threats to the emperor's safety or the stability of succession protocols. Each category carried its own range of punitive responses, escalating in severity, depending on perceived intent and impact. In the Joseon court, where Confucian orthodoxy was particularly emphasized, punishment mechanisms were deeply intertwined with moral pedagogy. Historical chronicles suggest that disciplinary actions were often framed as corrective education rather than purely punitive measures. Concubines and palace women subjected to discipline were expected to reflect on their conduct and demonstrate renewed adherence to ritual propriety. However, this ideological framing did not diminish the material consequences of punishment, which could include confinement, demotion, or permanent exclusion from palace favor networks. The role of eunuchs in enforcement cannot be understated. Eunuch administrators occupied a unique position within palace governance, as they had direct access to imperial spaces while remaining outside conventional lineage politics. This made them effective enforcers of discipline, particularly in contexts where neutrality was required. Eunuchs were often responsible for implementing confinement orders, delivering official notices of punishment, and maintaining surveillance over restricted individuals. Their administrative authority, combined with their physical presence within the inner palace, ensured that disciplinary measures could be executed efficiently and consistently. Chroniclers noted that punishment within concubine hierarchies was not only corrective, but also deterrent in function. The visibility of disciplinary actions served as a warning to others within the system, reinforcing behavioral expectations without requiring constant direct enforcement. In tightly controlled palace environments, the knowledge that misconduct could result in loss of status, isolation, or formal investigation was often sufficient to regulate behavior. This created a climate in which self-monitoring became an essential survival strategy within the inner court. At the same time, historical analysis suggests that the system was not entirely uniform in its application. Variations in enforcement occurred depending on the political strength of the emperor, the influence of competing factions, and the internal stability of the dynasty. In periods of strong centralized control, disciplinary systems tended to operate with greater procedural consistency. In contrast, during times of political fragmentation or weakened imperial authority, enforcement could become irregular, with punishment decisions influenced more heavily by factional rivalry than by codified regulations. The cumulative effect of these systems was the creation of an environment in which concubines existed under continuous institutional observation. Their daily lives were shaped not only by formal rules, but also by the anticipation of potential scrutiny. This constant oversight reinforced the hierarchical structure of the palace, while also embedding discipline into the rhythm of everyday activity. Even routine actions, such as attendance at rituals, movement within palace corridors, or interaction with attendants, were subject to interpretation through the lens of compliance or deviation. Despite the severity often associated with these systems, historical records also indicate that periods of clemency and rehabilitation existed within the broader disciplinary framework. In certain cases, concubines who had been demoted or isolated could be restored to favor through demonstrated adherence to protocol or shifts in imperial preference. Such reversals underscore the dynamic nature of palace hierarchy, where punishment was not always permanent, but could be recalibrated in response to changing political and personal circumstances within the court. Overall, the punishment systems enforced on concubines functioned as an integral component of imperial governance, reflecting broader principles of hierarchy, order, and controlled behavior. Rather than existing as isolated practices of discipline, they were embedded within a comprehensive administrative structure that governed the inner palace as both a domestic and political institution. Historical records indicate that in later imperial developments, particularly during the late Ming and Qing periods, the internal governance of palace women and concubine hierarchies became even more systematized, reflecting the broader expansion of bureaucratic rationality within imperial administration. The inner court increasingly operated under formalized household statutes that were recorded, revised, and enforced with a level of procedural detail comparable to external state ministries. This convergence of domestic governance and state bureaucracy reinforced the principle that the imperial household was not separate from governance, but structurally integrated into it. Surviving Qing court archives and comparable institutional records suggest that punishment systems during this period were administered through a complex chain of command involving the imperial household department and specialized palace supervisory offices. These bodies were responsible for regulating everything from rank assignments to disciplinary enforcement. Within this structure, concubines were classified not only by rank but also by conduct records, which were maintained as part of ongoing behavioral documentation. These records functioned as long-term evaluations that could influence future promotions, restrictions, or punitive measures. One of the defining features of late imperial punishment systems was the increased emphasis on documentation. Every reported infraction, whether minor or severe, was expected to be recorded and submitted through formal channels. This bureaucratic emphasis created a paper-based memory of conduct that followed individuals throughout their palace tenure. Historical analysis suggests that this system reduced reliance on immediate discretionary punishment while increasing the long-term consequences of recorded behavior. Single documented violation could resurface during later evaluations, shaping outcomes years after the original incident. Within this framework, punishment continued to operate through a tiered structure. Non-physical disciplinary measures remain the most common form of correction. These include reductions in stipends, removal from ceremonial participation, and reassignment to less favorable living quarters within the palace complex. Such measures were not merely symbolic, they directly affected access to resources, social visibility, and proximity to imperial attention. In a system where favor and proximity determined survival and advancement, these administrative adjustments carried substantial weight. Historical records indicate that confinement practices also became more standardized during this period. Isolation was often implemented through designated palace residences, where individuals under discipline were required to remain for fixed or indeterminate periods. These confinements were supervised by palace attendants who ensured compliance with restrictions on movement and communication. The purpose of such confinement extended beyond punishment, functioning also as a mechanism for preventing factional influence, controlling information flow, and stabilizing internal court dynamics during periods of tension. The role of eunuch administration remained central throughout these developments. Eunuchs served as intermediaries between the imperial authority and the internal palace population, executing orders related to discipline, surveillance, and enforcement. Their institutional position allowed them to operate within both administrative and domestic spheres, making them essential to the functioning of punishment systems. Historical documentation indicates that eunuchs often maintained detailed internal logs of conduct, which were used to corroborate reports submitted by female palace supervisors and other officials. In addition to formal punishment mechanisms, informal systems of social regulation continued to operate within the palace environment. These included hierarchical peer monitoring, reputation networks, and controlled access to patronage relationships. While not codified in law, these systems reinforced official discipline by shaping behavior through anticipation of social consequences. Concubines standing within informal networks could significantly influence how strictly rules were enforced or how leniently infractions were interpreted, particularly in periods of weaker centralized oversight. Legal codes of the Qing imperial household revealed that more severe punishments were reserved for cases involving perceived threats to dynastic stability or violations of fundamental palace security protocols. Such cases were rare, but treated with exceptional seriousness. Investigations in these instances were conducted at higher administrative levels and could involve multiple layers of review. Punitive outcomes ranged from permanent removal from palace service to confinement under strict surveillance for extended durations. However, even in these cases, the emphasis remained on administrative control rather than public spectacle, reflecting the closed and highly regulated nature of the inner court. Contemporary chronicles and retrospective historical accounts also suggest that the punishment system was closely tied to broader ideological frameworks, particularly Confucian principles of hierarchy, obedience, and moral cultivation. Within this worldview, the conduct of palace women was not only a matter of personal behavior, but also a reflection of cosmic and political order. As a result, disciplinary actions were often framed as necessary corrections to restore balance within the institutional structure of the state. This ideological justification reinforced the legitimacy of punishment while embedding it within a broader moral narrative. Despite the rigidity of these systems, historical evidence indicates that flexibility remained an inherent feature of imperial governance. Imperial favor could override administrative penalties, and shifts in political alliances could alter the trajectory of disciplinary outcomes. Concubine who had been previously demoted or confined might later experience restoration of status if imperial preference changed or if political factions within the court shifted in influence. This dynamic introduced an element of unpredictability into an otherwise highly structured system, reinforcing the importance of adaptability and restraint among palace inhabitants. The lived reality of these systems was shaped by continuous negotiation between formal regulation and practical enforcement. While legal and administrative codes defined the boundaries of acceptable conduct, the application of punishment was mediated through human institutions subject to interpretation, bias, and political context. This interplay created a governance environment in which rules were consistently present, but variably enforced, depending on circumstance and authority structure.